but in terms of highways, roads, and bridges, and I can go on and on and on. If we get this right, we can create some jobs. I urge my colleagues to oppose the rule and support the underlying bill.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, 1 minute.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the rule and also to support the underlying bill, H.R. 380. This bill provides common sense reforms to the construction of water infrastructure projects, which will help facilitate commerce and get this country back to work, and it does so without earmarks. It also addresses our regulatory framework and builds common sense solutions that we can use. Article 1 of the Constitution clearly spells out that the federal government has a role in regulating commerce, and when we talk about building ports and dams, these are the type of projects that the federal government can and should undertake, which will allow the private sector to thrive, as well as encouraging private party participation. I want to thank the chairman and the committee for their work on this bill, which also advances the cause of the Savannah Harbor expansion project. Just one of the many projects that can move forward under this bill. Savannah Harbor deepening will allow the state of Georgia to begin construction on this much-needed project. When it is completed, consumers and businesses all across the country will benefit from the imports and exports that flow through Savannah. The bill also provides residents across the country with a framework that advances long-term economic growth opportunities by expanding and improving our sources of water supply. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased at this time to yield 2 minutes to the Dean of the House of Representatives, my good friend, Mr. Dingell.
Gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to revise my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud to say thanks to my good friend from Florida for yielding me this time. I urge that the rule be rejected. There's no reason why we can't have an opportunity to amend this legislation to address some of its failures. As the author of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, I was proud to usher in a new era of environmental and wildlife conservation. Moreover, NEPA passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support by a vote of 372 to 15. A similar vote took place in the Senate. During the debate on NEPA, I noted that mankind is playing an extremely dangerous game with his environment. We have not yet learned that we must consider the natural environment as a whole and to assess its quality continuously if we really wish to make strides in improving, preserving, and protecting it. NEPA has a very simple promise: look before leaping. The law ensures that federal agencies weigh the environmental consequences of development projects before they're undertaken. This bill puts its finger in the eye of that particular approach. I worry that the provisions included in the bill before us today will lead us down a path going back to those days of impunity and disregard for the well-being and concerns of the public, where actions were taken without any full appreciation or understanding of the environmental impact of that. That was the reason NEPA was passed, so that we would know what we were doing and so that we would have a fair opportunity for people to participate in the judgments by having these decisions made in an open and a transparent fashion. Now, perhaps changes are needed, and perhaps an update, if you will. We cannot say that this legislation does that. However, before we make changes, we need to have some comprehensive hearings in the Committee on Jurisdiction. I note that the committee that brings this legislation to the floor is not necessarily the Committee of Jurisdiction. This is a proposal which is disregarding one of the things which was said by President Nixon when he signed it. He said that this was going to start the decay of the environment.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Decay.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this time I yield to the gentleman from Texas, to Mr. Poe, for 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
I'd like to thank the chairman for the inclusion in the provisions of this bill to help expedite environmental reviews and language that was requested by myself and Congressman Farenthold, which would help increase private investment in our nation's ports and expedite the completion of large critical projects. One important project that is authorized in this bill is the deepening of the Sabine-Neches waterway. I've been working on the authorization of this project since I was elected in 2004. My predecessors, Nick Lampson and Jack Brooks, worked on this project. Mr. Weber, who now represents this area, has been working on this project. In fact, the original Chief's report for the Sabine-Neches Waterway was authorized to begin in 1997, 16 years ago. That was 3 presidents ago. It was in the last century. Since that time, all 4 of my kids have finished high school, graduated from college, gotten married, and have given me 10 grandkids. The United States has fought 2 major wars. 16 years to do an authorization on a federal project? Something wrong with this picture, Mr. Chairman. This project was supposed to cost $300 million. Today, if it's authorized, it will be $1.1 billion. That's a 287% increase, and we still haven't moved any dirt. There's something wrong with this picture, Mr. Chairman. That's why this WRRDA bill is so important. It makes critical structural improvements on the way the Corps of Engineers does business so we could end these absurd delays. It shouldn't take 20 years to complete a project, and I'm talking about authorization just to approve the project, like the Sabine-Neches Waterway. This waterway is critical to America's energy and national security. It was first authorized at 40 feet. This water bill will make it the depth 48 feet, permitting deeper draft vessels to come through. Right now, tankers that come up the Sabine-Neches Waterway can't be full because they drag bottom. They have to offload part of that fuel before they come up the waterway. That is why this is important to the United States. It's also vital to the United States military. The United States military, the Sabine-Neches Waterway, actually is the home of the largest commercial military outload port in America, and it's the 2nd largest in the world. The channel is home to 2 designated military strategic seaports, Beaumont and Port Arthur, Texas. Additionally, approximately 20% to 30% of the nation's commercial jet fuel and a significant majority of classified amount of our military's jet fuel is produced in the Sabine-Neches Waterway. This is the energy corridor of the United States. Refineries line this entire waterway. The delays by the Corps of Engineers have cost millions of dollars, all because they cannot make up their mind to approve the project. Mr. Speaker, pick a horse and ride it. Either approve the project or deny the project, but make up your mind. These delays are absurd.
3 seconds.
And that's just the way it is. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I don't need any more time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to yield for unanimous consent to my good friend from California, Ms. Loretta Sanchez.
I thank the gentleman from Florida, and Mr. Speaker, while not a perfect bill, I will be voting for this and ask unanimous consent to put forward my remarks to the House.
And, Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'm very pleased to yield to a former member of the Rules Committee, my good friend, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui. 2 minutes.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the gentleman from Florida for yielding me time. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support for the bipartisan WRRDA bill. I want to commend Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member Rahal, along with Chairman Gibbs and Ranking Member Bishop. I'd also like to thank Senator Boxer for leading the Senate in passing its WRRDA bill earlier this year. Mr. Speaker, my district of Sacramento is the most at-risk metropolitan area for major flooding, as it lies at the confluence of 2 great rivers, the American and the Sacramento. We have a lot at risk. We waited too long for this bill, and we need Congress to act. Since the last WRRDA in 2007, a number of key flood protection investments have been carefully studied by the Army Corps of Engineers. One such project that has been thoroughly studied by the Corps and holds a Chief's report is an Atomas Levee Improvement Project. Levee deficiencies were found in the area in 2008, and it was remapped by FEMA in 2008. The Corps put the level of protection at 1 and 33 years, a third of the national standard. Since then, costly flood insurance has become mandatory. The area is to be protected by the project is home to over 100,000 people, 2 interstate highways, and an international airport. It is heavily urbanized and home to dozens of schools and hundreds of small businesses. If a levee broke, the damage would be similar to that experienced in New Orleans. To fully underscore the importance of this project, my constituents have voluntarily voted twice to pay their local share. Despite the significant local investment, work remains uncompleted. The project needs congressional authorization. Mr. Speaker, we must pass this bill. We must establish a conference committee with the Senate, and we must work to ensure WRRDA becomes law this year. It is too important for our nation, and I look forward to working in a bipartisan way to ensure that. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Dr. Benechek.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 3080, as well as a bipartisan amendment that we will have on the floor later today. This bill works to address our nation's competitiveness and increase economic growth by maintaining our infrastructure in a sensible manner. Our amendment that we will offer today will work to address the challenges that invasive species present to our country today. Mr. Speaker, as the co-chair of the Invasive Species Caucus and the only member who has the privilege to represent 3 of the 5 Great Lakes, I'm honored to speak on the floor today about the threat these species bring to our natural environment. They also represent a huge economic cost to each of our districts. Do you know that it costs over $100 million a year in the Great Lakes alone to have these invasive species being fought and controlled? Mr. Speaker, our amendment is simple. It does not authorize any new funds or create new programs. Simply put, it helps address the invasive species issue by requiring the GAO to complete a comprehensive report on federal spending for the operations and costs of invasive species. Why is this important? A report that takes into account all species nationwide will allow Congress to identify both gaps and duplicative efforts in the future. By beginning with a comprehensive report, we can effectively target areas for improvement in the future. Mr. Speaker, I urge your support and all members' support for this bill and our amendment. I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, would you be kind enough to tell us the time remaining for both sides?
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, has 19.5 minutes remaining. And the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, has 16.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Ms. Hahn, who is the co-chair of the Ports Caucus, of which I'm a proud member.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the underlining bill. And as my colleague said, as the founder and co-chair, along with my friend Ted Poe, of the Congressional Ports Caucus, I'm happy that today the House has this opportunity to pass a water resources bill that will provide long-needed investment to our nation's ports and create jobs. Our ports and waterways have been waiting for over 6 years for a new water bill. It's time to end their wait. You know, one of the things I came to Congress to do was to fight for the full use of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and to ensure that we address the expanded use needs of ports like the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach that see so much commerce but so little of this harbor maintenance funding. Do I wish that we'd been able to be more aggressive in this bill? Of course. But the bill we have before us is a huge step in the right direction. Congress, I think, is finally recognizing that our ports aren't just gateways, they're engines of growth, of prosperity, and of jobs. Passing this legislation would be a big victory for our ports, a strong signal that this House recognizes the critical importance of our ports to our economic health. I'm going to be voting for this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield to my good friend from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, 4 minutes.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 4 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend on the Rules Committee for yielding. This is a big bill for Georgia. It's a big bill for all of America, Mr. Speaker. It's so often we hear about the conflict in this body. Well, when we all know that jobs are important to absolutely everyone's constituency, and when we all know that 99% of our imports and our exports travel through our ports, it's easy to come together and get excited about doing things that matter. We've got the Panama Canal opening for newer and wider, bigger ships, but my own home port in Savannah not ready, Mr. Speaker. Through no fault of our own, we began that process back in the 1990s to begin to expand the Port of Savannah, and it has taken 15 years to get through that permitting process. This bill, Mr. Speaker, says who benefits from that? Whose constituency is it that benefits from jobs being slowed or delayed for 15 years? No one's does. So we're able to come together and say, let's do it right, but let's do it in an efficient manner. 3 years is what we've given. 3 years, 36 months to study each and every aspect in the permitting process, and to do those things concurrently. Today, Mr. Speaker, as you know, you have to do one study first, and then a second one, and then a third one, and then a fourth one, and you can't start the next one until the first one has finished. Today, we say if we know we've got 6 studies to do, let's do them simultaneously. Let's go ahead and get all the work done. We all benefit from that, Mr. Speaker. The reforms in this bill go into those projects that are authorized, Mr. Speaker, that represent spending on our books that we know we're not going to do. We say if we have any new projects that we're interested in doing, let's take those old projects off that are no longer a priority for America. Let's set our priorities. We know we have to spend money in this government, but we ought to spend it on the best projects, not the least of these. And this bill recognizes in a budget-neutral way a way to authorize those projects that are most important to us while removing those that are the least. Mr. Speaker, I live on in a county that relies on a Corps of Engineers lake. Working with the Corps of Engineers in partnership is critical to my community for our drinking water, for our recreation, for our economy. The Corps has been a good partner, but the Corps is often hamstrung by the laws that this Congress has put in place and by the implementation of those laws by administrations, both Republican and Democrat. This bill, Mr. Speaker, reclaims to this House, for both sides of the aisle, the authority to direct the projects of the Corps of Engineers, not through earmarks, Mr. Speaker, but by recognizing that constitutional responsibility that we have to our constituents back home to decide where those dollars are spent, how those projects are prioritized. Rather than punting on that issue, this bill reserves those powers rightfully to this House and to this Congress. Mr. Speaker, this bill is not everything that I would like for it to be. Candidly, in 3 years of serving in this Congress, I have yet to see a bill that is everything that I would like for it to be. But what I know is that this bill is a step in the right direction, a step that we can take, and a step that we must take. I thank my friend from Florida for his leadership on the issue, for his leadership on the Rules Committee, and for yielding me the time today. With that, I yield back the balance.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Weber, Mr. Webster, reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, my friend, Mr. Lowenthal.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Speaker. We are a country of interdependent states that share prosperity, challenges, and resources, united with a goal of a healthy economy supported by quality infrastructure. At times, though, inequities in the collection and distribution of federal resources create such an imbalance that one region is put at a distinct disadvantage. This is the case for California, which collects nearly 1/3 of the nation's harbor maintenance taxes, but receives less than 7% of the expenditures for port projects. Ms. Napolitano's amendment, had it been allowed to come to this floor, would have brought a measure of equity to this stark imbalance. I believe this was a missed opportunity for our nation's ports. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield to my fellow Floridian and good friend, Mr. Sutherland, 3 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the gentleman from Florida for yielding for me today. Today, I rise in support of this rule for the Water Resource Reform and Development Act, and I agree with my colleague on the other side of the aisle, the gentlelady from California, Mrs. Hahn. She understands how important this bill is, and as do I. Make no mistake, this is a jobs bill. We are going to be able to take advantage of economic opportunities because of this piece of legislation. I'm proud to serve as a member of the Transportation Committee, and that this bill passed unanimously out of committee is something that I think needs to be noted. This legislation enhances the Army Corps of Engineers' ability to develop and support America's port and waterway infrastructure. And it does so with full spending offsets and zero earmarks. That's the kind of common sense reform I believe the American people expect and deserve. This bill places hard caps on the time and cost of studies, eliminating duplications and delays, places a 3-year cap on those studies, and caps in dollar amounts of $3 million. It expands the role of public-private partnerships in water infrastructure and makes significant changes to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund that monies that are collected for harbor maintenance are more fully utilized for their design purpose. I know that's a novel idea, that those monies collected for Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund use would be there. And this bill addresses that. But perhaps most importantly, the people of my district, this bill begins a critically important conversation that began at the committee level on the impact of the decreased water flows down the ACF River system and into the Apalachicola Bay. The Apalachicola Bay is a national treasure, producing 90% of Florida's oyster harvest and 10% of the nation's oyster harvest. The oystermen and small businesses and hardworking families who depend on this bay have seen their livelihoods put at risk. I am pleased that Chairman Schuster and the ranking member have worked in good faith to begin this dialogue with me. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to support this rule, as well as the underlying bill, which provides critical support to Florida's 15 deepwater ports and allows us to be fully prepared for the economic opportunities as a result of the Panama Canal Zone expansion. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Speaker, could you tell me how much time I'm reserving? I am reserving my time.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, has 11.5 minutes remaining and reserves. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, my good friend and fellow Helsinki Commission member, Mr. McIntyre.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank Mr. Hastings for this time. As co-chairman of the Congressional Waterways Caucus, I do support many of the provisions of this bill, but I'm concerned that it has no language to reauthorize expiring coastal protection projects. Our beaches are the economic engines and environmental treasures that protect our coast from storms and create jobs for our community. In fact, when you talk about return on tax dollars, the beaches can't be beat. For every $1 spent by the federal government on beach renourishment, $320 are returned in revenue. I know of no other federal program that gives that kind of return. When we think about the inclusion of coastal renourishment projects, there are over 50 that will be expiring if this is not addressed. We have found, like at Carolina and Curie Beach in North Carolina, and as many of our colleagues all over the nation have found, a few $1,000s on the front side saves millions of dollars on the back side after a vicious storm like Sandy or Katrina or Fran or Hugo, and the list goes on. It's imperative that the WRRDA language contain the reauthorization of these projects that are already in progress, otherwise we lose these investments, and that is not a good use of taxpayer money. These are investments that ultimately create jobs and save money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time has expired. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd yield from the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Webster from Florida. I rise today in support of H.R. 3080, the Water Resource Reform and Development Act of 2013. WRRDA is common sense legislation that permits the Army Corps of Engineers to eliminate costly and duplicative projects caps the time and cost of studies, consolidates and accelerates environmental analysis, and stimulates the U.S. economy through increased competitiveness in the global market and through job creation. In my home state of Florida, our 15 ports have contributed to over $96 billion to the state's economy and, perhaps most importantly, employs hundreds of thousands of individuals. Within my district, we have 2 inland ports, and particularly in the Ocala and Lake City areas, which are uniquely positioned to import and export products quickly to Florida, the Southeast, and to the America's heartland. Encouraging an infrastructure projects such as these spur job creation. In today's economy, we cannot afford to neglect these opportunities. We have today the opportunity to demonstrate that Congress can work towards the best interest of our country, and so I urge my colleagues in the House to take swift action in voting to approve WRRDA and get our country back onto the path to safe infrastructure, global competitiveness, economic stability, and job creation. Mr. Speaker, I thank you and yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Webster from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Esty, at this time.
Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for the time, and I rise in support of the Water Resources Reform and Development Act because it's essential for our economy and it addresses flood control and water management issues important to my district. Waterways and ports support more than 27,000 jobs in Connecticut, but Congress hasn't passed a WRRDA bill since 2007. We can't wait another 6 years to ensure that our inland waterways and seaports remain the greatest in the world. I do have concerns about provisions meant to streamline environmental reviews, but this bill is the result of bipartisan cooperation, something all too rare in Washington these days. And as a co-sponsor, I am proud to say that this bill reflects the bipartisan action that my constituents expect from Congress. That's why I'm so grateful for my friend, Pennsylvania Chairman Schuster, as well as Ranking Member Rahal and Representative Bishop, for their responsible bipartisan leadership on this effort. If you're concerned about the economy, public safety, or the lack of funding for our water infrastructure, pass WRRDA today. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to clarify one thing, and that is the chairman and the ranking member did everything they could to stay within the guidelines and the jurisdiction of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and they did that. They did not vary in any way over into the Clean Water Act or anything else. So nothing in this bill is changing any of the standards. All it's doing is allowing parallel tracks. That's it. So the project mentioned by Mr. Woodall, which is 15 years, the project in Mr. Hastings' area, which is 17 years, would only be done sooner, not by circumventing any environmental requirement. It be done through the parallel tracks. And with that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend from Georgia, Mr. Kingston.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, in 1733, when General Oglethorpe sailed up the Savannah River, I've been told the river was 12 feet deep. We've been playing in the mud down there ever since. Today it's 42 feet deep. But 42 feet isn't enough for the large Panamax ships that will soon start coming through the expanded Panama Canal. If we are to stay competitive, we have to deepen the river. There are 352,000 jobs in Georgia related to import-export and the Port of Savannah. In fact, the cost-benefit analysis of this investment is $1 spent gives us a $5.50 return. In these tough economic times, that's why this legislation is so important. Furthermore, it's basically a reauthorization necessitated by bureaucratic delays. The original authority to deepen the Savannah River was in 1999. It took 13 years and $41 million worth of studies to finally get 4 federal agencies to approve it. During that period of time, China built a port from start to finish, which is bigger than the port of Savannah. Mr. Speaker, If we are to be competitive as a nation, we have to do better than this. Today's legislation accelerates the approval process by alleviating unnecessary government delays. This legislation is common sense. It's pro-job and pro-America, and I urge its passage. Thank you, and I yield back.
Yields back. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm privileged to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Washington, my friend Mr. Heck.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Water Resources Reform and Development Act, and I rise in support for a very good reason. This bill helps create jobs, good jobs, family wage jobs. And it's not just jobs in construction from the infrastructure projects. It's jobs throughout the shipping and transportation sectors. I happen to represent a district that contains a number of ports, including the Port of Olympia and parts of the Port of Tacoma. And activities at the Port of Tacoma alone are related to 113,000 jobs in Washington State. But there are more jobs to be found there and around the country if we act now. Mr. Speaker, I believe a healthy economy requires a healthy environment. And I hope that the final bill that is reported out of the conference committee does not get caught in the false premise of having to choose just one. However, I think this bill is a good bipartisan start, and I urge its passage. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
I have no more presenters, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, I would reserve my time.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, my friend Mr. Schneider.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This reauthorization is long overdue. There is no better way to put people back to work and stimulate our economy than to invest in our nation's infrastructure. In my home, the 10th District of Illinois, there are $235 million in projects that are waiting to get underway. The multiplier effect of these projects will have in our communities cannot be overstated. This bill makes a number of reforms that will benefit the communities in Illinois that I represent. It will, for the first time, recognize the Great Lakes Navigation System as the single system that it is. It will ensure that a portion of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund is dedicated to small harbors, like the one I represent in Waukegan. This bill is not perfect. I certainly have objections to some of the environmental streamlining provisions. That said, this bill is a great example of the progress that can be made when both sides come to the table and find common ground. I believe there is still more to be done to safeguard our environment in the underlying bill, and I look forward to working with the chairman and ranking member as this bill moves through the conference to ensure that adequate environmental protections are maintained in the final measure. I thank the gentleman and work forward to passing this bill.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased at this time to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlewoman from Maryland, my good friend Ms. Edwards.
Gentlewoman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today generally in support of the reauthorization of the Water Resources Development Act, but I do want to express a couple of concerns that I have. One is this discussion about reforms that I think really put in jeopardy what it is that we're trying to do, both in terms of developing our water resources, but also protecting our environment. I'm concerned about the streamlining under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. It doesn't slow down projects. In fact, it ensures that the general public, state and local government officials and industry have a seat at the table when federal agencies make decisions that impact our communities. Indeed, I'm offering an amendment along with my colleague, Mr. Blumenauer and Mr. DeFazio, that would restore our confidence in this system to make sure that we're really protecting our environment. My other concern, Mr. Speaker, is an amendment that's going to be offered, the Young and Petri amendment, that would in fact go back to the private sector for services instead of leaving that to the decision of the Army Corps of Engineers. And so with that, I yield the balance of my time, and I look forward to further working on these issues. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'll yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, my friend, Mr. Cartwright.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm encouraged that we have today before us a bipartisan bill that will help improve our nation's waterways and infrastructure and create jobs. However, I do agree that this bill is imperfect, and I am dismayed that this bill includes provisions that will undermine our environmental protections and reduce the ability for public input. And in that regard, I wish to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Dingell. What's left out is an environmental review process that avoids pitfalls and saves taxpayers money by allowing the Army Corps of Engineers to understand where problems may exist with their proposals. The bill also misses an opportunity to encourage the Corps to use natural infrastructure in its flood control projects in order to better address future extreme weather, safeguard our neighborhoods, and improve wildlife habitat. Non-structural alternatives to Corps projects should be considered as viable options. The project delays are overwhelmingly due to funding issues or changes to the project, not environmental review, and I urge my colleagues to fix these shortcomings in the conference committee process. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Minnesota, my friend, Mr. Ellis.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the gentleman from Florida for yielding the time. Environmental review isn't a problem, it's a good thing. Including citizens in projects and how they affect our community and their voices is important. Protecting water quality in natural areas that drive local economies is important. Saving tax dollars is important. And yet, unfortunately, in the minds of some, environmental review is a problem that needs to be streamlined. I don't call these environmental reviews streamlines something good. I say that they're just weakening a good process that allows people to be involved and participate. I think weakening the National Environmental Protection Act is short-sighted, misguided, and I oppose those particular provisions. While there are merits in this bill, there also is a problem, and weakening environmental review is chief among them, and I'm very disappointed those provisions are included in this bill. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to point out again, no environmental law has been changed. None. Nothing has been weakened. Nothing has been shortchanged. Nothing has been slowed down. The only thing that's happened is those studies, instead of being done in a linear path, one after another, are done simultaneously. It doesn't weaken anything. It doesn't undo anything. What it does do is speed up the process, which is very, very needed. I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, my good friend, Mr. Holt.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my friend from Florida. And despite some merits in the WRRDA bills that the Republicans have proposed, they failed to address the #1 reason why Corps of Engineers projects are delayed, a serious lack of federal funding. The bill before us perpetuates a myth that the problem is environmental review of engineering projects and not inadequate funding. In my congressional district, the Greenbrook project has been funded at $11 million per year. If this funding level continues, it will take more than 30 years to complete the project, which will eventually protect several flood-prone communities frequently at risk from extreme weather and save lives. Until then, the Greenbrook residents remain under threat. Now, every water resource project has effects on the environment and should have good environmental review. Streamlining environmental review will not save money or expedite construction. Limiting the national environmental review limits public participation, prevents identification of potentially costly problems, project stopping problems. Environmental review is not something to be tolerated, it is something to be welcomed.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Minnesota, my friend Mr. Nola.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, distinguished member from Florida, I rise in support of the Water Resource Reform and Development Act. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this legislation. It's a good example of bipartisanship and cooperation and common sense as opposed to some of the politics that have dominated this chamber. As a member of the Subcommittee on Water Resources, I was pleased to have had a part in several bipartisan provisions beneficial to the economy, to the environment, and to conservation. We're creating jobs and stimulating business income with this legislation. We're putting a stop to raids on the Harbor Maintenance Fund. We're expanding the definition of invasive species, now limited to plant life, to include animal life, species like zebra mussels and Asian carp. And we're closing the lock and dam at St. Anthony Falls to prevent the spread of Asian carp through the lakes of lakes and precious lakes and rivers of northern Minnesota. Mr. Speaker, by passing this bill, the Congress demonstrates that we are still capable of achieving reasonable, bipartisan solutions that solve problems and get things done here in this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to my good friend from Florida, Ms. Brown, to discuss our proposal if we defeat the previous question.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank my colleague from Florida for yielding time to me. My amendment is very simple. It authorizes the Corps projects to receive a final chief report up to 1 year following the enactment of the bill. Let's be clear, under the present arbitrary deadline, critical core projects of engineering throughout the United States will have to wait for years. This is the second core project that we've done in 14 years. Now, my colleagues from Florida keep saying that there is no change. There is a change in this project, in that in this particular bill, this is the first time that members did not have up to 2 years to get their chief report in. The chief report is long, it takes time, it's economically, environmentally justified, and it has to indicate it's a benefit to the entire country. Now, let me say one thing about this amendment. It does not change anything in the current bill. It pays the same way other projects is paid for. It is what we've always done. Authorize these additional projects would generate billions of dollars in economic activity, create hundreds and thousands of well-paying jobs. I want to yield 1 minute to my colleague, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you for the time. I rise once again, Mr. Speaker, to discuss an environmental catastrophe taking place in my district. And while I strongly support the underlying bill, without the amendment, it would force my constituents and residents from Florida to wait at least another 2 years for projects critical for our environment and our economy. The Central Everglades Planning Project, critical to the deteriorating health of the waterways in my district, is nearly ready to go. This project will safely move more water south of Lake Okeechobee instead of forcing...
I yield the distinguished gentlelady an additional 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
And I yield that 1 minute to Mr. Murphy.
Thank you. The project will safely move more water south of Lake Okeechobee instead of forcing polluted freshwater into brackish rivers to the east and west, causing immeasurable damage to our environment and our local economy. I urge my colleagues to oppose the previous question and support the common-sense, bipartisan Brown, Frankel, Crenshaw, Posey amendment that would allow the Army Corps to complete its work on authorizing several important projects that are in the final stages of approval. I spoke on the floor earlier today about the importance of acting now on initiatives that will help address the environmental crisis occurring in our area. Today, we have that chance. My constituents and our waterways cannot wait. Defeat the previous question and support the Brown amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady.
Yes, sir. If we defeat the previous question, we can bring up this amendment right now, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. at this time.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the distinguished gentleman from Florida and the manager, and he knows how important this whole bill is to the Texas Gulf region, and I thank him for yielding the time. Let me say that there are many things we'd like to fix in this bill, but I know that there are many Texans who are waiting for this bill to pass. And I was delighted to work with the Texas delegation to strengthen the bill by encouraging non-federal entities to invest in their harbor maintenance and step in when the Army Corps of Engineers cannot. I'm also delighted that we have addressed the question of dredging, and we should do it even better. I thank the Rules Committee for consenting to my amendment that deals with consultation with stakeholders and water districts, local, city, county government. I know my local governments are waiting to have the Army Corps of Engineers actually listen to them, as well as historically black colleges, minority institutions. I'm also looking forward to making sure that the $20 billion in projects through the DeFazio Amendment is included and not rejected. And finally, I hope that we can work together, Mr. Speaker, on ensuring minority and women-owned businesses in the billions of dollars that are used by the Army Corps of Engineers are actually getting the opportunity to work. I ask my colleagues to recognize the importance of this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
I would advise my good friend from Florida that I have no further speakers and I'm prepared to close if he is.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close also.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself the balance of the time. And how much time is that, Mr. Speaker?
Gentleman from Florida has 4.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This bill used to be known as the Water Resource Development Act. Now it's called the Water Resources Reform and Development Act. While it's with many of these new reforms that I take issue, I look forward to working with my friends on the other side of the aisle to make sure that we are here again in 2 years to again update our water resources and infrastructure, and hopefully a bill with less advised or ill-advised reforms. Mr. Speaker, if the previous question is defeated, I'm going to offer an amendment to allow for the inclusion of the bipartisan Brown Amendment, which would authorize projects that receive a final Chief of Engineers report up to 1 year following the enactment of this bill. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record, along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question. I urge a no vote on the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, yields back his time. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This rule provides for ample and open debate and makes in order amendments from both sides of the aisle. Further, it advances a bill that was reported out of the committee with a unanimous bipartisan support. This bill is good for American workers, good for American producers, good for American shippers. As my friend from Florida, Mr. Hastings, knows, this bill is also good for the state of Florida. Florida has 18 public seaports. These seaports are critical components to our economy. They are responsible for supporting more than 500,000 Florida jobs and for generating $66 billion in total economic value. The activities of these seaports contribute $1.7 billion to Florida's state and local budgets. Furthermore, this bill advances key ecosystem restoration projects in Florida Everglades and supports the economic development of that the Everglades provides in our state. I thank Chairman Schuster and for working with me and other Florida members to ensure that the state is well positioned to move forward. Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member Rahal and my colleagues on the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure have given us a bipartisan product that reforms the federal bureaucracy, is fiscally responsible, strengthens accountability, and creates jobs. Mr. Speaker, this is a good bill. I say to my colleagues in the House, if you support reforming the federal bureaucracy, if you are looking to manage our spending, if you are looking to increase transparency while investing in our infrastructure, and if you're looking to create American jobs, support this bill. Vote for the rule, vote for the bill, move the country forward. I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, yields back his time. Questions on order in the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of adoption. This is a 15-minute vote.
So the House holding the first roll call votes of the day as members vote on a procedural motion related to the rule for debating a measure that would establish a new process for determining which Army Corps of Engineers water resource projects move forward. It would also increase expenditures from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, change how those expenditures are allocated, and streamline environmental reviews and permitting. Should the rule itself be approved, we expect an hour of general debate and work on 24 of the 100 amendments submitted, with more votes to follow at about 5:30 Eastern. A vote on final passage is expected today in that final series of votes. So this would be the only legislative work for the rest of the day and for the week, as the House will not be in session tomorrow or Friday to allow members to attend the funeral of the late Congressman Bill Young, who died last week. While this vote is underway, a short time ago we spoke with a Capitol Hill reporter following this bill in the House.
Adam Snyder is transportation reporter for Politico. How much does this water bill cost, and what type of projects are included in it?
Great. Well, thank you for having me. First off, there's one thing to note, which is this is just an authorization, that any sort of specific funding would have to come through appropriations bills down the road. That said, it does set up about $8.2 billion in spending over the next 10 years. It's for a number of port and inland waterway projects around the country, and the ports and rivers around the country.
What's the view of the Transportation Committee Chair, Bill Schuster, who introduced the bill? How confident is he that it will be passed in the House?
He's very confident, not only about that this will be passed in the House, but he's even come out and said he'd love to see a water bill passed every 2 years. This is something that Congress has not been very good about. The last one was in 2007. It had been a long time leading up to that one. So he's really trying to set a high mark, not only for House passage here, but then to have Congress do something every 2 years on future water bills.
Was he or other GOP leaders concerned at all that yesterday a number of conservative outside groups, including Heritage Action, called on members to vote against the bill?
There doesn't seem to be a lot of concern from leadership. This does have very strong bipartisan support. Democrats are in strong support. Nick Rahal and Tim Bishop, two of the top Democrats on the Transportation Committee dealing with this water bill, have said they're a big fan, and they've really appreciated the way Schuster has reached out to them and worked with them. So, and also keep in mind, Schuster is also a member of the Republican whip team, so he's sort of working this from both sides. So they seem to be definitely very confident about this passage.
Well, the Rules Committee yesterday whittled down some 100 amendments to 24. What are some of the key ones we should look out for?
There was one that was ruled out of order that's a little notable, that would have allowed guns on Army Corps land. We saw that in a previous transportation bill with Amtrak. There's a vote on that. There's a couple that are in order. There's one from Kerry Bentivolio that would boost the amount of deauthorized projects. This bill sort of deauthorizes some of the old projects. It would vastly increase that from about $12 billion to $35 billion. And there's another notable one that's definitely one to watch. It's from 5 of the top Democrats on the committee, including Peter DeFazio, and that one would basically delay the bill's streamlining provisions until the backlog of projects, which is currently about $60 billion, until that's whittled all the way down to $20 billion. So you can imagine that would definitely have a delaying effect on some of these streamlining provisions in the bill.
This water bill is the kind of bill that in the past might have been laden with member earmarks. What's changed to make that so we don't see those anymore?
Right. Well, the bills do list some specific projects. They do comply with the earmark ban. That was one very easy way to secure a lot of votes in the past, was through earmarks. It's something that the committees have struggled with this time around, and they basically set up a process for these projects to be approved, that if they meet certain criteria, certain environmental reports and things like that, then they'll be approved. Army Corps obviously has to weigh in as well. And again, the goal is to go back and do this every 2 years, so there aren't this big backlog of projects, and it's something that they can revisit every 2 years.
Well, the Senate passed its version in May. Assuming passage in the House, what's ahead in the conference? What are some of the key issues that have to be worked out between the two measures?
Well, right, you have a good point. A lot of people, assuming House passage here, they're definitely looking forward to the House-Senate conference. Both chambers have made this a big priority. It was one of the first bills the Senate did. Barbara Boxer and David Vitter on the EPW committee in the Senate have been big proponents of this. There are definitely some differences on some of the pilot provisions as far as innovative finance. The bill's overall price tags are different. The Senate's a few $billion more expensive because it authorizes a few more projects. And in conference, also, we never know when some of this conservative outrage against the quote, Kentucky kickback, the Olmsted Locks and Dam project, we never know when that will crop back up and maybe complicate a conference.
Follow Adam Snyder on Twitter at Adam K. Snyder and read his reporting at Politico.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
House members are in the opening minutes of a procedural vote on a measure that would establish a new process for determining which Army Corps of Engineers water resource projects move forward. Votes on the rule for debating the measure expected after this, and then an hour of general debate on the bill. This is a 15-minute vote. And as the vote continues to tally, members of the House leadership of both parties held caucus meetings this morning to set the House agenda for the coming weeks. Here's what they had to say after the meetings, beginning with Speaker John Boehner.
Morning, everyone. You know, we had another jobs report yesterday, another, frankly, disappointing jobs report. This economy is not creating the jobs that the American people are looking for. Their wages are stagnant. And part of the problem is that we've got the whole threat of Obamacare continuing to hang over our economy like a wet blanket. Employers scared to death in terms of what they have to do and what they don't have to do, afraid to add new employees. And, you know, when you look at the problems with Obamacare, all the focus here lately has been on the website. Clearly, there's problems with the website. But I would argue that the problems go much further than that. How about the report over the last couple of days of the hundreds of thousands of Americans who are finding out that they're going to lose their coverage because the plans they have today don't qualify under Obamacare. And when you begin to look at these hundreds of thousands of people, I think what you're going to see at the end of October are more Americans are going to lose their health insurance than are going to sign up at these exchanges. This is a very serious problem. It's affecting our economy, and it's affecting the ability of the American people to find the job that will help them take care of themselves and their families.
Good morning. The rollout of Obamacare is nothing short of a debacle. And the American people are now fearful of their health care. I mean, they're downright scared about what's going to happen with their health care next year. And all we're hearing from the administration really is really unsatisfactory in terms of answers to the many, many unanswered questions. Yes, we all know the website doesn't work, and the administration keeps saying, well, just to the subscribers who want to go on, say go and try again. Well, again, there's so many unanswered questions that is adding to the fear of so many American people. And what's not helping is a lack of transparency on the part of this administration. This morning, I know that HHS officials will be up briefing the Democratic caucus. No intention initially to say that they were going to brief Republicans on what's going on. Last night we learned that federal officials asked insurers not to release numbers for the exchanges in terms of sign-ups. We still don't know these enrollment numbers. And HHS is blocking third-party verified traffic data. This is not transparency, and this is adding to the confusion and the fears surrounding the rollout of Obamacare. Now, in a couple of months, the Obamacare mandate tax is going to kick in, and many Americans are going to have to pay as much as 1% of their income to the federal government if they don't sign up on Obamacare. So how is that fair? I mean, with so many unanswered questions and the problems arising around this rollout, it doesn't make any sense to impose this 1% mandate tax on the American people. And that's why we Republicans remain committed to delaying that mandate tax of Obamacare so that finally we can get the answers that so many people are seeking, and we can try and reassure the millions of Americans who are growing in their fear about what this all means for their health care.
You know, it's another day and a new glitch for the Obamacare rollout. It's why only 12% of Americans, the latest CBS poll, says that it's going well. More than half believe it's not. But as I listened to the President do his press conference that we will handle it, we will fix it, it just rings back to the moment when he was proposing Obamacare and said if you had your health care and you liked it, you can keep it. It's not a glitch when an American citizen receives a letter and says their current health care, they will no longer have it. Many of the constituents that I have that I come out and see, the frustration that it is not fair in the process, that they don't have the health care that they can keep it, and if they go onto a website, they cannot see what they can have now. So when you look back and you look at the arguments, the complaints, the transparency and the accountability that we've asked for, none of that goes away. I think the focus will now be on where is the accountability in the process and where are the answers.
Moms, dads, seniors, young people continue to struggle all across this country, whether it is those that are out of work trying to find a job and the economy that continues to struggle, or those that are trying to get health insurance or losing their health insurance or having trouble getting their health insurance. As leaders here in Congress, our commitment is to continue to work on issues that are going to create jobs, that are going to create opportunities, and also ensure that people do have access to quality and affordable health care. The concerns are coming in every day right now, and the concern that actually this health care law is going to make it harder for people, it's actually going to make it worse for more people than it's going to help. And that's why we're launching the www.gop.gov Your Story, to have people all across this country share their story dealing with the new health care law so that we can go to work to ensure that moving forward we can take the action to help individuals, give them the protections that they need with this law. The delay of the individual mandate, the tax, the fee that they are facing, that employers have been given a pass on, we need to provide that fairness to individuals and families all across this country.
Conan said the other night, Obama is now urging Americans having trouble with the website to call 1-800 number. The 1-800 number is 1-800. We didn't think this through. Whether it's Fallon or Conan or Jon Stewart, Saturday Night Live, all of the jokes go on and on and on. But nothing is funny about losing your health care plan when you already had what you liked and you wanted to keep it. Nothing's funny about being forced on a website that doesn't work to buy health insurance that you don't want and can't afford. And it's even less funny when a government tax is hanging over your head and you don't have hours on end to go through the whole circus. This Obamacare exchange has been a complete and total failure, and it's unacceptable. The American people deserve better.
Good morning. I'm Congressman Tim Murphy of Pennsylvania, Chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation. Tomorrow we're going to have a hearing about the exchange website, and it'll be about the facts. We're approaching this investigation in a thoughtful and deliberate way. Here's what we know so far. HHS budgeted $55 million for just one company to build a website. Less than a year in, the agency had spent $93 million and then has since fronted away $300 million. In addition, other companies were hired to work on this website, and all told, more than $500 million was spent on a website that just doesn't work. The Energy and Commerce Committees will be real working hearings continuing our ongoing investigation into what went wrong and getting answers on the record, first with the contractors and next week with Secretary Sebelius. Repeatedly, over the last year, our committee and subcommittee was told by numerous administrative officials, don't worry, everything is fine, we have this under control. We know that that simply was not the case. Either they didn't know what was going on in their own offices, or they were deliberately misleading us and the American people with the hope of avoiding us from knowing what was really happening. Given all these questions, we should press pause on this President's tech surge where he wants to spend untold more amounts of money to throw that after a bad website when we don't really know if this one is even salvageable. This tech surge is comparable to trying to fix a car by overhauling it while it's still rolling down the highway. At some point you have to decide, can it be fixed or do we scrap this and get a new one? If 55 different contractors could not successfully build, test, and run a website in 3 years at a total cost of over $500 million, why should we believe the administration is capable of fixing it in 2 weeks, especially with someone who doesn't even have tech experience? With these hearings, we're going to find out. Did the breakdowns occur with the IT contractors, or were they told to do it this way by HHS? Did the outside contractors notify HHS when there were problems? How many people have been able to sign up using the website? Are they even capable of knowing how it's working? Was the site designed poorly because the White House sought to hide it from the public and hide the massive premium increases families are seeing? And why has the President tapped an individual to fix a technology problem without any technology problem experience? While we work to get the answers, we are deeply concerned about the number of Americans who are being told they will no longer have insurance. They're looking to this as an answer, and throughout the initial rollout of this, when Congress was voting on this, and it was we were pushed away from being able to work on this, we were told repeatedly that this website would be a wonder, that people would be able to look at it, compare policies, and make thoughtful and informed decisions about what's going on. Well, we still wonder what's going on and wonder why the American people cannot possibly make thoughtful, informed decisions about their insurance, and they're quite frightened. Thank you.
Jennifer.
Speaker, you have done many efforts in the House to repeal Obamacare. We know what happened with the efforts to defund Obamacare. Now that Americans are waking up to the issues here, do you think you have a better environment to do something? And what is the specific legislative strategy at this point?
Well, I think the biggest part of Congress's job is to provide proper oversight of the executive branch of government. And whether it's Obamacare or issues over at the Department of Defense, it's our job to hold them accountable. And when it comes to Obamacare, clearly there's an awful lot that needs to be held accountable.
Speaker Boehner, your friend Bill Kristol said on Morning Joe this morning that Paul Ryan would unveil the House GOP plan for health care reform sometime in January. Is it your understanding that that's going to happen, and can you give us an idea of what it might look like?
I'll let you talk to Paul about that.
But will it happen? Last question.
McConnell said defund was a tactical error and not smart. Do you agree with that?
Listen, we went through a very tough period. As I told my colleagues the other day, we fought the fight. We didn't win. We lived to fight another day. And the fact is that we're going to have issues about funding the government come January 15th. We're going to have the debt ceiling we're going to have to deal with again. The looming problems that are affecting our country are still there. We're spending more than what we bring.